Welcome to another history podcast. Today, I'm going to take you to ancient Rome. We will learn from the inside how the fascinating Roman Republic was founded. We will travel together with perfectly equipped Roman legions, hundreds of kilometers, and conquer everything that stands in our way. We will delve into what Rome looked like and how its economy functioned. We will build paved roads and aqueducts, learn about the customs of Roman families, and find out what ancient Roman society was like. Together, we will go to the gladiator arena and fight till death. And in the end, we will learn about the hero of today's episode, Spartacus. While Rome is often glorified, for some of its inhabitants it was an affliction so great that they preferred to risk everything and rise up, rather than live in such conditions a moment longer. It is the history of this uprising that I will also tell. So, let's begin. I remember waiting in history classes until we finally got to ancient Rome. Rome was not like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, or even Greece. Rome was the first historical superpower, real, huge, yet efficient as a Swiss watch, state law, money, invincible army, paved roads, aqueducts, art, science. All this seemed to be a light to those wandering in the darkness of barbarianism in the rest of the world. The majesty of the Imperium Romanum, the most powerful state of antiquity, was supposed to last forever. And indeed, Rome was immense, both in size and influence, even on the world today. After all, we write in a modified Roman alphabet in Latin. It is still used today by lawyers, biologists, and doctors. The world we know it as today largely dates back to Roman times. Roman law forms the basis of continental legislation. The principle of the presumption of innocence, after all, comes from the Romans. However, for all of this to have come into being, there must have been a beginning, a gap to develop. Truly, the beginning of Rome is no less fascinating than the legacy it left behind. Let me tell you the myth of the rise of Rome. This begins on April 21st, 753 BC, on the banks of the river Tiber in central Italy. The twins of Romulus and Remus were the grandsons of a king from the house of Latinum Nominator. His brother Amulius took power, threw Nominator into prison, and ordered his daughter Exilvi to become a priestess of the goddess Vesta. However, sentenced to a life of celibacy, she secretly gave birth to two boys. Their father, in turn, was none other than the god of war, Mars. Romulus and Remus were therefore half-gods and half-men, in whose veins flowed God's blood. As punishment for her betrayal, she lost her life, and her sons were to be thrown into the river and drowned. However, the merciful executioner placed Romulus and Remus in a basket and set them adrift downstream. They eventually came to rest in the shallows, and their cries were heard by a female wolf who fed and saved them. After the twins grew up, they founded their own city. It developed smoothly, and new residents slowly began to move in. Soon the brothers began arguing over who would rule the city or even have it named after them. The quarrel grew more and more heated, and eventually, during the quarrel, Romulus killed Remus. The new city would be named Rome after the victorious twin Romulus. In order to attract people to live in the new city as quickly as possible, Rome opened its gates to the poor, exiled and unwanted in other cities. This, however, proved problematic. Rome quickly gained a large male population, but there was virtually no females. Romulus began touring neighboring cities and tribes and tried to negotiate marriage rights with women from those cities. Rome, however, was known for being the seat of rather low-class society, so Romulus was met with constant refusals. Legend has it that desperate Romulus and Latins eventually invited a neighboring Sabina family to a festival as guests. At that festival, they kidnapped the unmarried maidens of the Sabines, leading to the forced integration of the Latins into the Sabines. This was the most famous of the legends about the rise of Rome. However, there is a second, less famous one, and I bet you've never heard of it. It was recorded by the Greek historian Dionysius. He wrote that Prince Aeneas led a group of brave Trojans on a sea voyage to establish a new Troy, since its original was destroyed at the end of the Trojan War. The journey was long and arduous, and above all, very dangerous. With many sea storms, the Trojans finally made it to shore. Soon after landing, however, the men wanted to go to sea again, but the woman who traveled with them did not want to return to the arduous search. The most desperate of these women, bearing the name Roma, planned a plot and told the other woman to set fire to the ships standing at sea. Then there would be no more possibility of further wandering. This was done, and the ships burnt completely. The men grew furious. They even wanted to kill Roma, but after a while, they quickly realized that they were in an ideal place to settle. They were at the top of 7 hills: Aventil, Palatine, Quirinus, Menau, Celius, Esquiline, and Capitol, which guaranteed safety. At the same time, the Tiber River gave access to fresh water, fish, and provided transportation. When they realized there was no longer any point in trying to look for a new Troy, they named the settlement after the woman who set fire to their ships, Roma. And so, not only did Roma escape death, but her name was made eternal. Regardless of which version of the myth of the rise of Rome you believe, the fact is that in the middle of the 8th century BC, this ancient city began its epic history. It was founded on the Palatine, one of the hills above the Tiber River. At first it was a small settlement, but soon it grew considerably, absorbing more areas delineated by more hills. This development was favored by the natural conditions. Rome was located in the middle of Italy, and the Tiber River provided a natural link to the sea. The city controlled the north-south trade route and the salt resources at the mouth of the river. Eventually, the city encompassed 7 hills that provided shelter for its inhabitants. We like to think that Rome was more or less homogeneous. However, before it became an empire, there was no such thing as a single universal Roman state. The Apennine Peninsula, which is the distinctive shoe shape on the map entering the Mediterranean Sea, once was a collection of many different people. The Latins, who inhabit Latium, bordered the north, with the Etruscan people, who appeared here on the Apennine Peninsula in the 10th century BC. Before that, the Phoenicians, who lived on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, reached the peninsula. From the 8th century BC, Sicily and southern Italy were subjected to the great colonization of the Greeks. I mention the Etruscans for a reason, because the first Roman kings came from them. The first king of Rome was Romulus, and it was from him that the period of monarchy in ancient Rome begins. The coming decades of Roman history were ruled by kings of Etruscan origin. By the end of the 7th century BC, they formed an aristocratic and monarchist elite there, exercising control over the remaining settlements. Monarchy is a form of government in which a king or queen has full power over a city or empire. In Latin, this was called an imperium and was forfeited to the king. The ruler, or rex, commanded the army and had full civil, judicial, and religious authority. The reign of the Etruscan kings, however, did not last long. As far as we know from the few sources from that period, the Etruscan kings were somehow overthrown at the end of the 6th century BC. Most likely they abused their power, perhaps unable to communicate with the people, but we don't know this for sure. What we do know is that Rome eventually became a republic in which, as in ancient Greece, the civic community, in Latin res publica or civitas, ruled. From these names are derived our modern terms such as republic or civil. This republica or commonwealth was composed of citizens. Everyone was subject to one law, they had certain duties and became equal, unlike the previous monarchy. I believe that the Roman Republic is where the real magic begins. At every opportunity, the Romans demonstrated their ability to organize themselves and to strengthen and increase the efficiency of the new state. They began to arrange state powers from scratch. The tasks of the deposed kings were distributed among senior officials. The conduct of the politics and the command of the army were entrusted to 2 consuls, the annually elected highest officials. Both had identical positions and powers. This allowed them to control each other and thus prevented them from abusing their influence. The Romans, however, were clever. What if the consuls could not communicate with each other? To prevent the consuls from abusing their power, they had to act in consultation with the Senate. The Senate was composed of experienced citizens, often having previously held various offices, and were referred to as elders. The consuls themselves also sat in the Senate. The Senate oversaw the state's finances and also advised officials, while their decisions either went into effect immediately or were put to a vote. And when a danger arose, such as a war or uprising, a dictator was elected in place of the two consuls, who were granted absolute power for a maximum of 6 months, so as to prevent a crisis. Today we associate dictatorship negatively, but in the Roman Republic it was believed that when war came, all decisions had to be made instantly by one person, who would not have to consult everything with others. Consuls and the Senate were not everything. Adult men participated in committees. Central committees elected consuls, praetors, and censors, and decided on the declaration of wars, while also electing certain officials, for example, tribunes or quaestors. This is still not all. There was also other offices in Rome. Quaestors assisted the consuls in financial matters. Censors prepared a census of citizens and, based on their wealth, assigned them to the appropriate centuria and tribus. Praetors were in charge of the judiciary. There were also military tribunes who assisted the consuls in military matters, the people's tribunes whose job was to protect the people from abuse by other officials. You must admit that for ancient times, the scale of sophistication was significant. But let's leave the purely political issues for a moment. After all, the Romans became famous first and foremost as great conquerors. Over the centuries, they claimed vast territories and quickly extended their power. Rome did not have enough land to provide decent conditions for all its citizens. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans were not mariners and therefore could not solve issues of land scarcity through colonization. This meant that in order to achieve territorial expansion, they had to take land from other countries. Rome was not unique in this regard. Conditions in Italy in the early Republic made it virtually impossible for Rome or any other state to avoid wars. At the time, there was literally hundreds of small independent states and countries that competed with each other for limited resources. Most of these states needed land and could only take it from their neighbors. Therefore, war soon became a permanent feature in Roman life at an early stage of its development. In addition to the struggle for territory, however, the waging of wars had a more mundane cause. It was simply the desire to gain glory. The Roman virtues were the virtues of war. For instance, if a consul won a significant battle, his prestige would increase. As a result, he and his relatives would find it easier to win elections for offices in the future, and he would receive greater military duties and constantly a higher salary. Even ordinary soldiers gained great prestige when they fought in important Roman victories, receiving land and shares in the spoils of war. Romans were always ready and willing to fight if only a country gave them a reason to do so, and there was always a reason, for it was the mentioned land. We already know why Rome fought and conquered. Let's find out how it did it. For conquests, you first need an army, and the Roman army was the largest and strongest fighting force in the ancient world. It conquered vast territories that eventually stretched from Britain to the Middle East. The Roman army was very advanced for its time. Soldiers were highly trained, had the best weapons and armor. Not to throw words to the wind, when the Romans invaded Britain, their army was already so strong that it defeated an enemy force 10 times larger. The Roman soldier was a well-trained fighting machine. He could march 35 kilometers a day, wearing all his armor and equipment. He could swim or cross rivers by boat, build bridges, and penetrate forts. After marching for days, Roman soldiers had to build a camp that included a defensive ditch and a wall of wooden stakes. The following day, they had to repeat the process, and so on, endlessly. Roman soldiers were ruthlessly obedient, and anyone who objected faced harsh punishments. Even falling asleep on duty once meant an immediate death sentence. Most of a Roman soldier's life was spent training. They practiced fighting in formations and dueling. Legionaries also patrolled conquered territories and built roads, forts, and aqueducts. Only men were allowed to be in the Roman army. There were two types of Roman soldiers: legionaries and auxilia. Legionaries were elite soldiers. A legionary had to be at least 17 years old and a Roman citizen. Every new recruit had to be in excellent shape, and those that were weak and were short were immediately rejected. A legionary signed up for at least 25 years of service. If he survived, he was rewarded with land that he could farm for the rest of his days. Auxiliaries were supporting units to the legions. They were soldiers who were not Roman citizens and were paid only a third of a legionary's salary. Auxiliary units were responsible for guarding forts and borders, but also fought in battles, often on the front lines where it was most dangerous. At its peak, there were 500,000 soldiers in the Roman army. To keep such a large number of men in check, it was divided into groups called legions. Each legion had more than 4,000 soldiers. The legion was further divided into groups of 80 soldiers called centurions, and the general was called a centurion. He carried a short rod to show his commanding importance. He also used this rod to beat any soldier who disobeyed him. A perfectly trained army needed excellent equipment, which, together with a talented soldier, formed an impenetrable barrage. The basic element of Roman armament was the helmet, or galea, a shield, first oval and then later rectangular, armor which was either carriage armor or chainmail, and in the next period segmented armor, a heavy spear or javelin, a short double-edged sword called gladius, and sandals. With the years and the development of the military, the weapons of the legionaries were enriched with bows, or arcus, and arrows, or sagatti. In addition to these, crossbow slings were used, which were drawn with a special instrument. Roman soldiers typically lined up in a compact formation for battle. The tactics of the Roman legions were based on maintaining this formation to allow each soldier to fight effectively on their own. At the time, most commanders of other ancient countries simply threw all their troops into attack and counted on their superior strength. The Romans realized that they could not always rely on brute force alone, so they turned to strategy. Each combat situation was considered separately, taking into account the terrain, the type and strength of the enemy's troops, and their own troops. It was Roman tactics that accounted for the superiority of Roman armies over others. The Romans came up with something unique when it came to defensive formation: the turtle. This formation was used by the Roman legions for protecting against enemy fire. The turtle involved forming a compact rectangular column, with legionaries usually 25 in the first row and side in formation, holding their shields vertically in front of them or from their exposed side. Legionaries from the inner ranks held their shields horizontally above them and above the legionaries of the first and side ranks. In this way, a shield was created for the entire formation against enemy fire. Moving in such a column, the legionaries resembled a sheltered turtle shell and were perfectly protected from arrows. Shortly before the start of the battle, the commander would address the assembled Roman troops with a special speech called adlocutio. None but one speech has survived, a residual one at that, based on what we know about the Romans' literature and the way they formulated their laws. Such speeches before a battle might have sounded like this, for example: "My brothers, today we face adversity. We dedicated to the code of strength and victory of the warrior. And although death is a backup, we will never know defeat when we stand against it together. Today we will write another triumph to our history. To stand here with you is an honor. What we do today, we do as humble servants of the gods. Let us ask them for courage and strength, respect them in our hearts, and they will help us today. Look at your weapons. Look to the skies now, and raise a mighty shout in honor of the gods. And now to battle." Before the battle, the signal was given to the troops by trumpets. After a series of arrow shots, the soldiers marched at a slow, steady pace toward the enemy. At the last moment, they would hurl javelins and draw swords, then attack the army. The legion usually had one goal: to smash the center of the enemy formation, usually the most numerous, but less trained and not as armed. Kill the commander to cause panic and take away the enemy's desire to continue fighting. Then, using cavalry, they would catch up with everyone who tried to flee the battlefield. Rome's earliest conquests can be divided into three parts: the conquest of central, then northern, and then southern Italy. Let's begin with central. Between 400 and 500 BC, Rome fought primarily against the hill tribes and surrounding towns in central Italy. In the 390s, another threat appeared, this time from the North Celtic tribes called Gauls. They began to invade central Italy, and the Romans organized resistance among other Italian cities against these invasions. By the end of 350 BC, the Romans were able to defeat the Gauls and establish their authority over northern Italy. In 282 BC, the Romans received an appeal from some old Greek cities in southern Italy to help them resist one of the minor Hellenistic kingdoms, the kingdom of Epirus. The Romans agreed to provide this resistance and fought a king named Pyrrhus. Not only was he defeated, but more importantly, southern Italy was conquered. Thus, by 275 BC, the Romans controlled all of Italy. Everything so far was going well for Rome. However, they soon found further adversity. In 264 BC, the Great Punic Wars began, over control of the Mediterranean. The main opponent turned out to be Carthage. The Punic Wars were fought against Carthage of the old Phoenician colony of the northern coast of Africa. In 264, Carthage was similar to Rome in that it was powerful, controlled a lot of territory including Spain, and had an appetite for more. The reason for the war was therefore very simple. Rome and Carthage were the two great powers in the central Mediterranean. It was inevitable that these two would eventually clash. During the First Punic War, most of the fighting took place at sea around Sicily. The Romans were at a disadvantage because they had no navy until then. They quickly built up several large fleets, peering at ship designs from their Italian and Greek allies. They probably also employed them as rowers. Rome's defeats were tremendous, but they eventually won through their perseverance. 20 years later, the Second Punic War broke out. What distinguished the second from the first is that the Carthaginian army was then commanded by one of the military geniuses of the ancient world, Hannibal, commander of the armies of ancient Carthage. The relentless, self-confident and charismatic ruler forced the Roman Empire to defend its borders heroically. The Greek historian Polybius described Hannibal as follows: "He led them with Africans, Spaniards, Celtics, Thalars, and Greeks, people who naturally had nothing in common in terms of law, customs, language, or anything else. It didn't matter, because thanks to Hannibal's leadership skills, he is able to impose his authority with a single word, with a single gesture, even on people of such different origins." And indeed, Hannibal, in his brilliant move, decided to take the war directly to the foothills of Rome. He led his forces into Italy in 2018 BC and began defeating the Romans in battle after battle. However, he was never able to break through the city itself. Rome was constantly being repelled from around the capital. Every time the Romans fought Hannibal, they lost, so they decided to harass his army by marching up and down Italy. In other words, they exhausted Hannibal's army. Then in 204 BC, the Roman army under the command of the famous commander Scipio of Africa landed in Africa and threatened Carthage itself. Desperate Hannibal was forced to leave Italy and defend his home at the Battle of Zamum. Carthage was defeated by the Romans for the first time. This was the end of Hannibal. he fled to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the east, and Carthage surrendered. In addition, Carthage had to destroy its fleet, hand over part of its African possessions to Rome's allies, and pay a huge contribution. The third and last Punic War between 149 and 146 BC already took place in Carthage's African territories and ended with its capture and demolition. According to legend, the land after Carthage was sprinkled with salt so that nothing would ever grow on it. Rome became the major power in the central Mediterranean. Victories in the Punic Wars were the crowning achievements of Rome's conquests. They allowed the creation of a true empire in the western Mediterranean, as well as the military and economic basis for later expansions to the east. That's not all, however. The destruction of Carthage, despite the changing turns of the wars, was one of the most significant events shaping the consciousness of Roman society, and was a testament to the perseverance and ruthlessness of the state seeking to expand its political and economic influence over the largest possible area. The figure of Hannibal, on the other hand, was hated by the Romans for centuries. However, there were also negatives to this victory. Although the Roman Republic began a period of real domination, the Punic Wars caused great damage to the agricultural economy of Italy, as soldiers had to be separated from the cultivation of the land for years, and the battles themselves brought great destruction to replace the current farmers at work. The Roman authorities brought hundreds of thousands of slaves to Italy, who were supplied by the subsequent conquests. Slaves. How do we associate this word today? Exclusively negatively. And yet, at the time during the late Roman Republic, slaves were a pillar of the foundation of Roman society. So let me begin with Roman society and life in this mature Roman Republic. Describing Roman society is a difficult task. Over the many centuries of history of the ancient empire, society underwent numerous changes, influenced by the conquests and expansion of Roman territory, the wealth of the population, and historical events. The various social layers were also shaped and changed according to the form of government. Rome was the largest urban center in the empire, with a population estimated to be nearly 1 million in its final period. Public spaces in Rome were filled with the sounds of hooves and iron chariot wheels clattering. The noise was so exasperating that Julius Caesar once tried to ban the movement of chariots during the day, as he was disturbed by the traffic. Historical estimates show that about 20% of the population under the jurisdiction of ancient Rome lived in urban centers, such as Rome and other large cities. This is a very high urbanization rate, especially for that period. Most of these centers had a forum of temples and other Roman-like structures. Life expectancy was about 28 years. Roman society underwent numerous changes over the years. What it looked like was influenced by conquests and increasing Roman territories. In the earliest days of the monarchy, Roman society was based on a family system. These families had exclusive rights to occupy offices. The beginning of the Republic brought the formation of two main social groups, the patricians and the plebeians. The first of these groups was the Roman aristocracy. Patrician means descent from ancient Roman families. Patricians considered themselves the only ones who could exercise power. Plebeians, from the word plebs, meaning common folk in the early days, had no access to power. They engaged in crafts, merchantry, and agriculture. Over the time, they began to understand their importance for the functioning of the city, especially for its defense, as they also served in the army, and for this reason began to fight for their rights. Later, a class emerged between them known as equites, who were moderately wealthy Romans. They could afford to own a horse, which was the marker of this class. They served in the army in higher positions and were also engaged in trade. And what was domestic life like in Rome? The family was the basic cell of Roman society. The father was the head of the family, making all decisions regarding finances and raising children. Fathers had full control over their children, regardless of their age or marital status, from birth to death. A father even had the right to decide whether his newborn child would be raised at home or abandoned. Childbirth took place at home, attended by a midwife and the mother's slaves. It was customary for men not to attend the birth, although sometimes in homes of the upper classes, a doctor was called to be on hand in case of a difficult delivery. After the baby was born and cleaned, it was laid on the floor in a blanket, and the father was called into the room. He would carefully inspect his child and make one or two gestures. If he picked up the infant, it meant that the baby had been welcomed into the house. If, on the other hand, the father turned away, it meant that the child had to be abandoned. An abandoned child was taken out of the house and left to die on the street. The father could reject the child for any reason, and whatever the reason, his will was final and unquestionable. These abandoned infants were often rescued by slave traders who raised them and later sold them as slaves. Women were subject to the will of their fathers throughout their lives. Even after marriage, they had no voice or political power. Daughters were taught how to run a household, take care of their husbands, and help advance their husbands' careers. Later in the Roman Republic, women began to gain more rights, but all the time they remained under the control of their fathers and husbands. Despite this, women could file for divorce with a man's consent, perform abortions, inherit, manage and sell property. Women from the lower classes could also work in stores and sell goods such as jewelry, clothing, and pottery. When a woman reached the age of about 15, her father would find a suitable person to marry. Marriage ceremonies had a set order and were very solemn. They took place at dawn just after sunrise. This symbolized the new life the couple was entering. The ceremony required 10 witnesses. To make it legal, the bride recited the traditional vows. Afterward, the wedding party, following the bride and groom, walked to the couple's new house for a feast. While walking, the bride left 1 coin dedicated to the spirit of the ways as an offering to bring good luck on the future path of marriage. She also gave her new husband 2 coins, one in his honor personally and the second in honor of the spirits of his home. Along the way, the groom threw nuts and candy into the crowd. This ritual still survives today in the form of throwing rice at weddings. When reaching the groom's house, he would pick up the bride and carry her across the threshold. This gesture is still known today. The scholar Harold Johnson suggests that it may have symbolized the capture of the woman, thus alluding to the story of the rape of the Sabine woman in early Rome. While this is theoretically possible, it is more likely that carrying the bride prevented her from tripping and falling, which in turn would have been a very bad omen for marriage. However, it is most likely that it was a symbolic gesture, removing the woman from her old life and bringing her into the new one. Then the feast would begin. Close friends and family were invited into the house, and the husband offered his new wife fire and water as essential elements of the household. The wife would light the first fire as a symbol of the beginning of a new family. Since men dominated the social hierarchy, the Roman household focused mainly on the firstborn son. 9 days after the birth of a male child, the child was given a name as a purification ceremony known as lustratio. He was also given an amulet to ward off evil spirits. The amulet for boys was called bulla, and the amulet for girls, lunula. Boys were raised to take over their father's activities. And if the father was a patrician or equitina, as in one of the upper classes, they also rode horses, hunted and fought. During the Roman Republic, military service was compulsory, so every man learned fighting skills regardless of class. The girls, as I mentioned, were raised to be wives and mothers. We're now going to talk a little bit about Rome's heritage. The Romans were very proud of their law. It is not without reason that Roman law had a significant impact on the development of European legislation. Along with engineering, it was the second field in which the Romans achieved great success. However, the codification of Roman law itself came relatively late, only at the turn of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Roman jurists began to write down commentaries, which in codified form became one of the most valuable cultural heritages of medieval Europe. Rome law is still taught in universities around the world today. As for religion, it was visible at every turn in Rome. The state sponsored and supported homogeneous religious beliefs and rituals. Religion was meant to strengthen the state. Throughout the year, public festivals were held in honor of the gods of great deeds and in honor of the harvest delivered through providence. The greatest festival of the Roman calendar was the Saturnalia, in honor of the agricultural god, the seed of sowing and harvest Saturn. Saturnalia was celebrated from December 17th to the 23rd, and during this holiday all work was halted and stores were closed. Saturnalia was the only time of year when the head of the household relinquished responsibility and a younger male of the household took control. All rituals and laws were relaxed, and slaves could join in the festivities as equals. Saturnalia was a real big celebration. People dressed in colorful costumes, decorated their homes with flowers, wreaths and ceramic figurines, and invited friends and family to join. Gifts were exchanged, including small Saturn figurines, and the day after the holiday, everything went back to normal. Let's talk about how Rome made money and what its economy was based on. Ancient Rome had a vast area of land with many natural and human resources. As such, Rome's economy was centered on agriculture and trade. Olive oil and wine were the two main exports. Industrial and manufacturing activities were smaller. The largest such activity was stone quarrying, which provided building materials for the construction industry of the time. In the factories, production was already on a relatively small scale and generally consisted of workshops and small factories that employed at most a few dozen workers. The economy of the early Roman Republic was largely based on small farms and paid labor. Rome had a highly developed monetary system, with brass, bronze, and coins made of precious stones in circulation. Some of these coins were found outside of the empire, even in India. Life in ancient Rome revolved around the city, located on the aforementioned 7 hills. This city had a huge number of great buildings, like the Colosseum or the Pantheon. It had theaters, gymnasiums, functional markets, sewers, and bath complexes, along with libraries and stores. Fountains with fresh drinking water were placed in the streets, which were supplied by hundreds of kilometers of aqueducts. Throughout the territory under the control of ancient Rome, residential architecture ranged from modest houses to large villas. In the capital of Rome, there were residences on the elegant Palatine Hill, from which the word palace is derived. Plebeians and ecclesiastes lived closer to the city centers, crowded into apartments. Let's now speak about something more down to earth: cuisine. Ancient Roman cuisine changed over the long duration of its civilization. Both men and women drank wine with their meals, creating a tradition that has survived to this day. The ancient Roman diet contained many elements that are based on today's modern Italian cuisine. Plinius the Elder described more than 30 varieties of olives, 40 types of pear figs, native and those imported from Africa and the western provinces, as well as a wide range of vegetables, including carrots of various colors but not orange, celery, garlic, flowering buds, cabbage, beets, green peas, artichokes, and cucumbers. It is worth knowing that some of the dishes now considered characteristic of modern Italian cuisine were not known at all in the Roman Republic. Spinach and eggplant, for example, were imported later from the Arab world, but most importantly, the tomatoes so characteristic of Italy were only discovered in the New World and brought to Europe many centuries later. The Romans knew of the existence of rice, but it was not often available to them. They also sometimes planted citrus lemons that were known in Italy from the 2nd century AD, but they were not widely grown. As for meats, beef was an unusual luxury. Pork was a much more popular meat, especially processed into sausage form. Fish was much more common than meat, and the Romans were also involved in snail farming. I mentioned impressive technological achievements, and indeed, ancient Rome had much to be proud of. Roman civil engineering and military engineering accounted for much of the superiority of Rome's heritage over other countries and contributed to the construction of hundreds of miles of roads, bridges, aqueducts, baths, theatres and arenas. Many monuments, such as the Colosseum and Pantheon, remain a testament to Roman culture and engineering to this day. The Romans were renowned for their architecture, which merged with Greek architecture to create classical architecture. This style is still recognized and taught today. Although there were many differences from Greek architecture, Rome simply borrowed some elements from the Greeks. We see this in the strict schematic building designs and distinctive proportions. The achievements of the 1st century BC did not end there, as the Romans began to use concrete extensively. This invention of antiquity was forgotten during the later medieval period. In Roman times, concrete was known for its remarkable durability and water resistance. Many monuments of ancient Rome throughout the Mediterranean were made of concrete, which is why many of them have survived to this day. The Romans also built largely from wood. This resulted in the rapid clearing of forests surrounding Rome, as the demand for wood was so great. Roman roads, on the other hand, are a completely separate story. With solid foundations and excellent drainage, Roman roads are widely known for their durability, and many sections of the Roman road system were still used 1,000 years later. After the fall of Rome, the construction of an extensive and efficient travel network throughout the empire dramatically increased Rome's power and influence. Roads allowed the rapid movement of Roman legions to anticipate the timing of marches between key points in the empire, regardless of the time of year. Roads were also economically important, reinforcing Rome's role as a crossroads of trade. This, by the way, is the source of the saying, "All roads lead to Rome," for that is indeed what it was at the time. The Romans also built numerous aqueducts to supply water to cities and industries and to help agriculture. An aqueduct is a type of bridge erected solely to carry and deliver water. At one point, Rome was supplied by 11 massive aqueducts with a total length of 450 kilometers. Most of the aqueducts were built along the surface, and only a few small parts above the ground were supported by arches. This is obvious to us today, but back then, running water in cities was a huge jump in civilization. The Romans also made significant advances in sanitation. They were famous for their beautiful public baths called thermae, which served both hygienic and social purposes. In addition to these achievements, we associate Rome with brutal, bloody, but at the same time incredibly fascinating entertainment. Entertainment that to this day is unequivocally associated with Rome. You know what I mean. The gladiatorial combat. Gladiatorial battles were one of the most popular Roman entertainments. Many wealthy Romans had their own private gladiators and paid fortunes for their training. These duels had their origins back in the Etruscan rituals associated with funeral ceremonies, but were rather sporadic and mostly seen at exceptional events in those days. Over time, the great spectacles, often involving exotic animals, and the excitement of watching athletic competitions became available to everyone without exception, regardless of background or wallet size. The gladiators who fought during these struggles either quickly became popular heroes or died disgraced as defeated. Gladiators had to gain popularity, recognition for their valor, or at least arouse positive emotions in the audience. The duel could end in a win, loss, or draw, causing the audience to decide the fate of the defeated gladiator. In case of defeat, the audience could either save him or condemn him to death. Fights were fought according to certain rules and rituals. This was overseen by a referee and were fought mostly to the death. Initially, gladiators were equipped with only the basic weapon of a sword and only had shields and visors for defense. Later, however, as gladiatorial combat increased in popularity, this changed. Separate classes of gladiators were formed and clashed with each other. Samnita, for example, wore richly decorated armor consisting of an open helmet with cheek flaps and a plume, while the chest was protected by special plates. Part of the Samnita's costume were also metal gauntlets and a large oval or square shield as they fought with a sword. Hoplomeos had a built-in helmet with a high chest, a large square shield and a sword. Thracian wore a simple open helmet with cheek flaps, a small round shield, and a short curved sword or javelin. Retiarus wore armor only on his hips, and with a shoulder shield he fought with a special throwing net, as well as a trident and dagger. Secutor wore a smooth helmet so that the thrown net would not catch on protruding parts. Andebates is perhaps the strangest type of gladiator. He wore a helmet without eye holes and fought blindly against an opponent wearing the same helmet. Locating the opponent was made easier by the buzzing of the chainmail worn by blind gladiators and the shouts of the audience giving the combatants clues. Eques, or a horseman, fought with a lance or sword, defended himself with a small round shield with armor on his chest and bandages put on his arms. Escalates fought from a cart driven by a coachman, using a bow and lance and a sword at close range. Ancient Rome also had female gladiators, while slaves were forced to fight and volunteers fought for money and fame. Their performances were not common and were intended to enhance the main duels in the arena. Female gladiators did not fight men, but only among themselves, usually only to the first blood or to injury. The gladiatorial fights were announced well in advance on posters that stated the place, the date, and the number of gladiators paired. It was also announced that executions would be carried out during the intervals, what music would be played, and all the luxuries to be provided for spectators, such as awnings to protect them from the sun, water sprinklers, food, drinks, and candy. For gamblers, types and bets were distributed. The night before, gladiators were given a banquet to put their personal, private affairs in order. When the day of the fight came, the setting was incredibly festive. The procession, or pomp, entered the arena, led by the lictors. They were followed by trumpeters, playing fanfares. Images of the gods were brought in to be witnessed, and then a scribe entered to record the score, and a man carrying a palm branch, which were used to honor the winners. At the very end, the gladiators would enter. However, there was no immediate battle between gladiators. Ceremonies often began with beast hunts or clashes with animals. For example, lions fought tigers. The next stage consisted of reenactments of Greek and Roman myths, and in the process, the execution of slaves. Gladiators were sometimes involved as executioners. Gladiators then had informal warm-up matches using blunt weapons. The editor then inspected the equipment chosen by the gladiator for the fight. There was complete freedom of choice of weaponry and its adornment. Some weapons were extravagantly decorated with feathers, jewels, and precious metals. After all these ceremonies and rituals, finally the gladiatorial combat would begin. Most clashes lasted between 10 and 15 minutes, with between 10 and 13 fights held in a single day. Spectators had their preferences, preferring to watch highly skilled, well-matched gladiators with complementary fighting styles. Such fights were the most impressive, but they were also the most costly in training and preparation. If any gladiator procrastinated too much or was not eager to fight, he might be whipped or rushed with a hot iron until he engaged out of desperation. Fights between experienced, well-trained gladiators displayed a considerable degree of stage art. Bravery and skill in combat were valued above mere chopping and bloodshed. Some gladiators made a real character and reputation for their spectacular victories. The gladiatorial fights were accompanied by a musical setting played live. To build tension, the fight was accompanied by trumpet sounds. The match was won by the gladiator who defeated his opponent. For example, he disarmed him, seriously injured him, or simply killed him. Winners received a palm branch and a prize, while an outstanding gladiator could receive a laurel crown and money from a grateful crowd. But the greatest prize was liberation or emancipation, symbolized by the gift of a wooden training sword. I managed to source the description of a fight between two gladiators, Priscus and Verus. They fought so evenly and so bravely for such a long time that at one point both of them, extremely exhausted at the same time, surrendered. Despite this, as a reward for their valor and for their martial art, both received victory and were liberated. During the clash of the gladiators, at any moment he could admit defeat by raising his finger in an appeal to the referee to stop the fight and ask the audience to decide the gladiator's fate. According to custom, it was the spectators who decided whether to spare the losing gladiator or condemn him to death. A defeated or wounded gladiator would be beaten by his opponent to die, while the gladiator should never have asked for mercy. A good death saved the gladiator from a shameful weakness and passivity of defeat. It also set a noble example for those who watched the struggle. The Romans had a very honorable attitude to death. For example, Seneca wrote, "Death, when it is close enough, gives us the courage not to try to avoid what is already inevitable." In the end, the body of a gladiator was placed on a couch and carried to the morgue of the arena, where the corpse was stripped of its armor, and to be sure, the throat was cut to prove that the deceased was indeed dead. Today we like to think of gladiators as romantic warriors, fighting almost chivalrous battles. But the facts are different. Being a gladiator was almost never a voluntary decision. Gladiators were almost always slaves. I mentioned slavery earlier, but now I'll focus on it. This will give us a good understanding of the upcoming events. I invite you into the darker side of the Roman Empire. Slavery was a pervasive feature in the Roman world. Slaves served in households, agriculture, mines, workshops, construction, and a wide range of urban services. It was estimated that 1 in 4 inhabitants of the empire was a slave, and it was on the foundation of slavery that the entire Roman state and society was built. Slaves were a distinct group of Roman society and was deprived of all rights and treated as a speaking tool. The slave was the property of his master, who in turn could do with him whatever he wished. The symbol of this was a special iron hoop on which there was a notice to whom the slave should be returned in the event of his escape. That's not all. For repeated attempts to escape, they were burnt on the forehead with the letter F from the Latin word fugitus, meaning fugitive. Slaves were most often recruited from prisoners of war, although this was not the only way to fall into slavery. One could be born a slave, which immediately identified a person to join the ranks of servants. One's own family could also sell anyone into slavery. Finally, one could also become a slave for debt. Slaves performed a wide variety of tasks, and their fate depended solely on the will of their master. Some slaves were paid for their labor, which meant that after some extended time they could buy their way out of slavery. Freedom could also be offered to them by their master in recognition of merit. In his will, for example, these slaves then became liberators or liberty. In Rome, slavery was common and normal, just as normal as it is for us to go to work. This led to pathologies. For example, someone could be so rich that he abused slaves and then bought new ones. As an example, I found such a letter by the Roman writer Seneca. He describes the plight of a domestic slave to his friend Lucius. In this letter, he describes a slave waiting for his master at a meal. "My dear Lucius, it is not uncommon to see such a picture. The master eats more than his stomach can accommodate. His excessive greed puts a strain on a bloated stomach that has already stunted its function, and it takes an enormous amount of effort to digest all that food. All this is what the starved, unhappy slaves are looking at, standing around waiting for the meal to be finished. They themselves have not even been given a bite. They are not allowed to make a single sound, to move their lips even for a single word. Any murmur is punished by striking the rod. Even voluntary body sounds, coughing, sneezing, choking, are not exempt from the whip. If word breaks the silence, the punishment is severe. The hungry slaves stand all night of this strange feast." Later in the letter, Seneca described in detail the abuse suffered by the slaves. He also described the arrogance of the masters. "Remember that the man you call a slave grew from the same seed. He enjoys the same sunlight, breathes like you, lives like you, dies like you. And yet these people are treated as less than human. We treat animals better than these unfortunates. When we sit at the table, one slave wipes the spit off the floor, another one crouches to pick up the leftover food, another cuts into pieces of expensive meat, separates the portion with a deft swipe of a skilled hand, and does exclusively this day after day. What a miserable person, to live solely to cut up poultry decently. Still, another is tasked with keeping a guest book. There stands this poor man, and watches whose overindulgence of the esophagus and tongue he will see every day after. The mistreatment of slaves had a specific reason. A person's will as an individual had to be broken in order to have a submissive, obedient servant who would meet expectations. Slaves were profitable only if they were submissive and did what they were told, without question, without hesitation. The fact that the slave population was so large at the time is a testament to the absolute ability of the Romans to maintain this kind of control over the enslaved. To be fair, it should be noted that not all slaves were mistreated. There were those who were treated well by their masters, and who in return willingly worked to protect the master's home, property, and life. For example, two famous philosophers were slaves, Diogenes and Epictetus. Both were treated as family members. Diogenes was given complete control over the boy's education at home, while Epictetus was sent to study Stoic philosophy. However, these are few exceptions to the general rule, and the vast majority of slaves had a very hard life with no hope of gaining freedom or rights. You may ask, why did the slaves not rebel? Yes, the cruelty and thoughtlessly treated slaves objected, but the Romans quickly and efficiently suppressed the isolated breakout of rebellion. In return, the rebellion itself testified to extreme desperation. After all, slaves were not allowed to bear arms, so the idea of a group uprising was almost abstract. Nevertheless, sometimes such group uprisings did occur. The first real slave uprising was the rebellion in Sicily between 135 and 132 BC. Sicily was home to a large number of slaves. They were not cared for and were not provided with food or shelter or even clothing. The rebellion was led by a Persian-born Eunice, who led to the independence of the entire island from Roman rule. Eunice also headed the new state as a monarch named Antioch. It took more than 3 years for Roman troops to eliminate the rebellion in Sicily. Nearly 30 years later, again from the same reason and again in Sicily, there was another slave uprising. This was between 103 and 100 BC. A spontaneous revolt of 4,000 slaves as a consequence of the greed and cruelty of the owners of cheap power and labor triggered another local uprising. To unite the slaves under his command, Slavius led 3 expeditions of the Roman army to restore the power of Rome, which ended in failure. Only the next one defeated the rebel army and abolished the state, formed by the existing slaves. After the second slave uprising, 30 long years of oppression and humiliation passed. History, however, was soon to repeat itself again. This time, however, the repercussions were to be much more serious. Meet Spartacus, a gladiator whose name will go down in history in eternal letters, and whose name will be known and respected to this day. Spartacus was a Thracian native of the region north of Macedonia, considered by both Greeks and Romans to be uncivilized and even barbaric. However, according to Platar, Spartacus is described as a Greek in other sources. Platar also notes that Spartacus was extremely intelligent and highly cultured. Nothing is known about his youth or how he became a slave and ended up in Rome, although a tremendous amount is known about what Spartacus did as one of the few slaves to rise against Rome. The main source of knowledge about the rise of Spartacus are the historians Appian, Laurus, and Plutarch. These 3 historians, in turn, benefited from earlier works by Salustasis and Livesius. Thus, it can be said that knowledge of Spartacus is the fruit of centuries of joint work. Yet another historian writing in the time of Hadrian, Lucius Annaeus Florus, adds a sensationalist thread to the story. He claims that Spartacus was a Roman mercenary in the legions, who was imprisoned for desertion and robbery, and chosen as a gladiator thanks to his strength. According to Appian, Spartacus was a Thracian who once fought against the Romans and became a gladiator after being taken prisoner for sale. Plutarch gives a similar description of Spartacus as a mercenary for Rome, who was captured with his wife after desertion. His wife is described as an inspired prophetess who, along with Spartacus, instigated the revolt and led it side by side with him until their mutual end. Regardless of where Spartacus came from and regardless of how he was captured and for what reasons, we know one thing. His excellent military training and muscular physique made him an ideal candidate for the gladiatorial arena. All ancient sources describe Spartacus as tall and exceptionally strong. I know that he was bought by the trainer Lentulus Batiatus and sent to a gladiatorial school south of Rome in Capua near Naples. It is very close from there to Pompeii and the majestic Vesuvius. The fighting school, like other gladiatorial schools, was famous for its harsh treatment of slaves to prepare them well for fighting. This discipline was aimed at breaking the will of the individual and instilling absolute obedience. It was from his exile to the school that it became clear that Spartacus was different from the other slaves. He could not be broken by the beatings of the oppressed and still retained his fortitude. It is obvious that no diaries or letters of Spartacus have survived. In fact, we don't even know if he was literate. What we do know is that in 73 BC, Spartacus and several other conspirators devised a plan to escape from the gladiatorial school complex and head north for freedom. This was something unprecedented. The vision of achieving freedom not by winning it in the arena and not receiving it as a gift, but by making it an escape of their own, hit fertile ground. Spartacus's plan and his charisma were so convincing that more and more gladiators wanted to participate in preparations for the escape. At one point, there were more than 200 potential slave conspirators. With so many people involved, it will probably come as no surprise that information about the planned escape leaked to the gladiator school authorities. These in turn notified Roman officials. Spartacus knew he had no time to waste. He knew that all the conspirators would soon be arrested, subjected to torture, and then killed. And this is another moment when Spartacus proved to be an exceptional leader. Instead of fleeing on his own, he decided that he would start a fight against the Romans. He must have known that he had no chance for freedom, but he wanted at least a taste of it, fighting side by side with other slaves against his oppressors. Spartacus spread the word among the slaves that instead of running away, they would stand up to the fight with their heads raised. 78 gladiators answered his call, and that same evening they broke into the kitchen and armed themselves with knives and skewers, then murdered their instructors. After a quick search, they found more weapons in storage. They also managed to take a transport cart before everyone knew what had happened. Spartacus and his 78 companions fled the school to a nearby village, where they set up camp somewhere on the slopes of nearby Vesuvius. There, a symbolic but significant act took place. The insurgents gathered around a campfire in the evening and officially elected their leaders. Spartacus was the natural choice for leader. In addition, on his left and right stood Ognomeos and Crixos, who fought most bravely alongside Spartacus. Although the ex-gladiators chose 3 leaders, every ancient source claims that Spartacus was the supreme commander. Appian writes, with gladiators Ognomeos and Crixos as subordinates, plundered the nearby areas, and as Spartacus divided the spoils in equal shares among all his comrades, soon more began to join. News of the rebellion quickly spread, and many slaves from plantations throughout the country began to leave their homes and join the rebels. Eventually, the Roman state was informed of the incidents. This, as we know, was not the first slave uprising, and all previous ones had been smashed. Therefore, the Senate was completely unconcerned about the Spartacus uprising. To restore order, the Roman commander Gaius Claudius Glaber was sent with his troops. The troops of Gaius were newly recruited and untrained in battle. The terminating of the slave revolt seemed an ideal training task. After all, slaves could not know anything about military tactics, right? If only they knew that the slaves were commanded by a former soldier of the Roman army. Gaius had already reached the slaves' camp at the top of the hill, surrounded them on the slope of the mountain, and prepared for the final assault. The mountain, however, was thick with vine branches, and this was brilliantly exploited by Spartacus, who ordered his men to weave vines into makeshift ladders so that they could descend the mountain over the cliff, which Gaius had not secured, thinking that there was no way the insurgent could get out just from that side. The slaves surrounded the camp of the Roman troops and, at the sign of Spartacus, moved to attack. The Romans did not expect a surprise attack and fell one by one in droves. The morale of the Roman troops evaporated, and at the same time the insurgents felt their strength increase with each Roman killed. As the uprising began to have a chance of success, the insurgents gathered up the weapons, armor, food and drink left behind, when no Roman was left alive. There was no end to the celebrations. When news of the general's stunning defeat reached the Senate, initially no one could believe that the former slaves had triumphed over the proud Roman army. The dismayed senators decided to send another division. It was commanded by Publius Verinus, praetor and proconsul. He was a much more experienced strategist. Remembering the defeat of the previous general, he decided to divide his forces, perhaps hoping to catch the enemy in a vice and crush them. After a few days, Verinus finally faced Spartacus's insurgents. We don't quite know how the battle turned out, but whatever Verinus's plan was, his failure was spectacular. Spartacus's victory was so complete that Verinus even lost his horse on which he rode into battle. It was no longer just a military victory. With the Romans being humiliated twice in a row, news of Spartacus's uprising began to spread widely. The news even reached many other slaves in the empire, who learned of a former slave leading others to freedom and feared by the Romans. After these two great victories of Spartacus, more and more slaves left their homes and joined the rebellion. The Roman Senate realized that it had seriously underestimated Spartacus. According to estimates at the time, he already commanded an army of more than 70,000 former slaves. The matter had become very serious. They therefore summoned two experienced consuls, Publicol and Claudianus, to lead his forces against Spartacus, who controlled the countryside at the time, and new rebels were arriving daily. This in turn emboldened the rebels, who had already begun to attack minor Roman towns. There was no doubt that if Spartacus decided to move on the capital, they posed a great threat to it. Spartacus, however, had no intention of marching on Rome. On the contrary, he led his army north to cross the Apennines and allow his followers to return to their families and homes to enjoy their newly regained freedom. Unfortunately, by then so many slaves had joined Spartacus that it was impossible to move efficiently with such a large group, so he divided his forces into two armies and placed his deputy Crixus at the head of one of these armies. It was then that the clash with Publicol and Claudianus took place. Roman troops under the command of Publicol attacked the forces of Crixus, while the troops under Claudianus struck the Spartacus army. Crixus's forces suffered heavy losses because Publicol was an excellent commander. In the meantime, however, Spartacus defeated Claudianus and at the very last moment saved his fellow man's army from the massacre inflicted on them by Publicol. Unfortunately, Spartacus arrived too late to save Crixus himself. He fell in the battle. The sight of his fallen comrade angered Spartacus. This was the first significant defeat, and it's safe to say that Spartacus did not take it well. This is a serious understatement. To give the Romans a clear sign, he ordered the killing of 300 Roman captives. This, however, was not enough for him to soothe the pain of losing Crixus. So he organized his own gladiatorial displays, ordering the remaining Roman captives to fight each other. He then burnt all the carts and supplies he could not use and marched toward Rome. At that point, even despite this defeat, Spartacus had more than 120,000 peasant slaves and ex-gladiators under his command. While Spartacus planned to move on Rome itself, he did not have any siege machinery to effectively attack the capital of the empire. In turn, the plan to flee with his forces to the north was no longer feasible, as winter was approaching, which is very cold in northern Italy. So the ever-growing army of former slaves was now marching south. It was reaching the third year of the uprising, and the Romans knew what havoc Spartacus was wreaking. Soon they sent two armies against him. In vain the slaves defeated them both. Appian writes, although at first ridiculed and considered trivial, now the war with the remaining slaves had been going on for 3 years and was of great concern. In fact, just imagine this. You live and reside in a large city, and at the same time you are aware that just outside its walls for the past 3 years, you can at any time encounter hundreds of thousands of slaves who have made it their goal to take revenge against their oppressors. That is you. The Roman army was powerless, while the slaves were trained by Spartacus and became increasingly proficient in battlefield tactics. The Senate could wait no longer. It appointed a new commander-in-chief of the army, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was a well-known and respected politician and commander. Before he began his military career, he had made a considerable fortune in construction, mining, and illegal loans at interest. He was also a very cynical businessman, having organized a private fire department for the city of Rome. Whenever a fire broke out, Crassus and his firemen would show up on the scene and first buy back the burning building along with the land for nothing, and only then would his men proceed to extinguish the fire. In this way, he became the owner of a large part of Roman real estate. Crassus demanded an account of the state of affairs. It was clear that more than 120,000 slaves under the leadership of Spartacus was spreading fear in the empire, and the Roman army had been suffering defeat after defeat for several years. Crassus knew that he had to convince the soldiers of his vision of the battle. What would you do in such a situation? How would you convince the troops to fight better? Maybe a pay raise, perhaps a promise of quicker dismissal from the army if only the uprising could be crushed. Crassus took a different route. He gathered the legions fighting slaves and inflicted the punishment of decimation. As soldiers, regardless of rank and class, age or merit, drew lots. Every 10th lot meant immediate death by beheading. After the punishment was carried out, the next drew lots. This punishment meant an immediate 10% weakening of the army. Now you know what type of commander was Crassus. According to Capian at the time, he established himself in the eyes of the people as someone who inspired fear greater than death at the hands of Spartacus, and that was exactly the point. Crassus wanted to crush the uprising very quickly. He marched out against Spartacus to a meeting in the far south of Italy under Brundisium. At the time, Spartacus's plan was to team up with the pirates. But where did this idea come from? Well, the pirates were kindred spirits with the freed slaves. Both groups hated the Romans and were willing to work with anyone who opposed them. Spartacus presented them with a plan to take over Roman-occupied Sicily and turn it into a free land for all those who had recently been freed. Unfortunately, the plan was about to fail. The pirates were supposed to meet Spartacus on the coast of Brundisium, but they never arrived. Crassus, meanwhile, ordered his army of more than 32,000 soldiers to build fortifications across the entire width of the peninsula, so as not to allow Spartacus to return. This was a brilliant move. Spartacus was then in the very south of Italy, from Sicily a few kilometers off the coast. However, he had no way to get across the water. He also had no way to get back to inland Italy. They were cut off by Crassus's fortifications. Soon the insurgents began to run out of supplies. Spartacus tried to break through the fortifications of Crassus, but was repulsed, while losing 6,000 of his men. According to Florus, Spartacus then tried to escape by water, building rafts from wooden beams and emptied barrels. This attempt also failed. Desperate, Spartacus resorted to guerrilla tactics. Appian writes how Spartacus carried out many minor harassments and siege strikes, and how he crucified a Roman prisoner in no man's land to demonstrate to his own soldiers the fate that awaited them if they were defeated. Crassus, however, was behind the fortifications and waited for hunger and desperation to do the work instead of his soldiers. Crassus's plan required patience, which the Roman Senate lacked, for it decided that Crassus was not acting fast enough. The famous general Pompagus, the conqueror of Spain, was summoned. Crassus, on hearing this, intensified his efforts to defeat Spartacus before Pompagus could steal his glory. As Crassus moved over his fortifications, Spartacus managed to slip a little to the north, but was quickly caught up by Crassus' forces. The final clash between the insurgents and the army of Rome was looming. Spartacus was about to lead his army into battle for the last time. It was known that there would be no more battles. The winner takes all. The meeting of the two armies took place at the river Salaris. Crassus had about 40,000 soldiers. The size of Spartacus's army, on the other hand, is estimated at the time at 60,000. Elite Roman legions versus slaves, who took all their tactical training on the battlefield from Spartacus. Let's think about what Spartacus felt at that moment. After all, this is one of the moments that must define a person's life. Everything else recedes into the background, and our fate, our history, our heritage will be decided in the next few hours. I think Spartacus thought the same. When the battle was about to begin, knowing that he was facing it for the last time, he gathered his men around him and asked them to bring him his horse. He drew his sword and killed it, saying that if they won, they would take away the Romans' much better horses, and if they lost, they wouldn't need horses at all anyway. A clear symbol that a definitive and decisive battle was coming. Spartacus lined up his troops with the strongest in front, placing the lighter armored in the center and the horsemen on the wings. The Romans, on the other hand, stood in front of the camp, through which they had previously dug deep trenches. As soon as the two armies clashed, the battle turned into a series of duels. According to Plutarch, Spartacus fought with real fury. He headed straight for Crassus himself, charging forward through wounded men, and although he did not reach Crassus, he cut down 2 centurions at the same time. In the end, when his men threw themselves into the fight, he himself, surrounded by enemies, got to his feet and died fighting to the end. According to Appian, Spartacus was wounded in the thigh with a spear. Despite falling on one knee, he held a shield in front of him and fought against his attackers. Eventually, he and a large number of his followers were surrounded and fell in the battle. Florus wrote, Spartacus fell just as he became a leader, standing in the front line and inspiring others until his last breath. His body was never found, while the 6,000 surviving slaves, on the other hand, were crucified along the road Appius from Rome to Capui, and their bodies were left there to rot for years as a warning to future slave uprisings. Spartacus's life was extinguished with the termination of the uprising. However, his story has yet to begin. The slave uprising was widely regarded in Rome as a disgrace, and the fact that Spartacus resisted so long and bravely was particularly difficult for the Roman pride. Despite this, something unprecedented in the tone of the narrative of the time began to happen. He began to receive admiration, especially from Plutarch. Whenever the writer mentions Spartacus's victories, and particularly when reporting on his death, one can sense admiration and awe. There is something amazing about this, something we don't see in Roman records before. It is this narrative that inspired later artists to portray Spartacus as a freedom fighter against the unjust power of Rome, fighting to end slavery. Yet none of the ancient accounts provide any basis of such conclusions. What is historically true is only that Spartacus was a gladiator who sought freedom and became the leader of a slave revolt. Over the years, however, he gained status as a freedom fighter and hero. The real development of the myth of Spartacus as a freedom-fighting rebel began in the late 19th century. It was then that the French tragedy Spartacus, written by Bernard Joseph in 1760 AD, premiered. It was inspired by the writings of Plutarch and added some silent issues in the history of Spartacus. The premiere of this play further propelled the most mythological version of Spartacus in literature, historiography, and political speeches. Spartacus began to be exalted to the status of an idealized advocate of the oppressed and enslaved. The very popular play was revived in 1792 after the French Revolution, and statues of Spartacus began to appear in France as early as 1830. The story of Spartacus was later taken up by Italian novelist Raffaello Giofanoli in 1874 in his novel Spartacus, in which he drew a parallel between the ancient Thracian gladiator and the then general Giuseppe Garibaldi, who united Italy in the 1860s. The 20th century came, and with it the beginning of television novelist Howard Fast, who wrote his historical novel Spartacus in 1951, which fell into the hands of the then fledgling director. You may be familiar with a name like Stanley Kubrick. In 1960, he made the film Spartacus. The famous scene at the end of the film when he cries out, "I am Spartacus," was interpreted by critics as a call of solidarity and to resist oppression. Kubrick's film received 4 Oscars and is still highly reviewed today. And then came the 21st century. Subsequently, both TV movies like the 2004 film Spartacus and a series from 2010 to 2013 were made. The version of Spartacus as a romantic, good, strong and charismatic leader of the oppressed and the poor has now become commonplace. Today, Spartacus is admired as an inspirational figure for any oppressed or unjustly marginalized group in society. Whether through racism, sexism, or homophobia, a lone individual defying the oppressive power of the majority, a rebel fighting against an unjust system of laws and prejudices, is all that Spartacus symbolizes today. None of the sources indicate that Spartacus was driven by an ideological concern to overturn the Roman social structure of the time. Spartacus was simply trying to lead his forces out of Italy toward freedom, not to reform a reverse Roman society. Keep in mind, however, that this does not change the assessment of Spartacus's achievements. The courage, perseverance, and skill of the Thracian gladiator, who built an army of 120,000 men from a handful of slaves in just over 2 years, can only inspire admiration. The legacy of Spartacus is immense, and we encounter it on a daily basis, although we often don't even realize it. All the time there are, for example, many sports clubs around the world named after the Roman gladiator, such as FC Spartak Moscow. In modern times, Spartacus has become an icon for communists and socialists. Karl Marx mentioned Spartacus as one of his heroes and described him as the greatest man of all ancient history, a great general of noble character and a true representative of the ancient workers. The history of Spartacus will probably forever inspire people and symbolize an individual fighting for justice and for the freedom of his people in the face of impossible odds. I like to think to myself that it probably no longer matters whether Spartacus started the rebellion to end slavery in Rome and free his people, or whether he simply wanted to escape from Rome. What matters is what Spartacus began to symbolize. The real Spartacus, whoever he was, has been replaced by the symbol of a hero. Why? Because a hero is what people have always needed, and what they still need and will continue to need. It doesn't matter if it was 2,000 years ago, today, or in the future. Thank you very much for listening. I encourage you to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.